Two Boeing 747s collide on a runway in the Canary Islands. 583 people are dead, and the world now wants to know what caused such a disastrous event. Go behind the scenes to find out what really happened. Figure out what changes needed to be made for safety to improve. It's time to go behind the disaster. March 27th, 1977. It's an abnormally busy day at Tenerife Airport in the Spanish Canary Islands. The airport, usually reserved for regional aircraft, is experiencing a huge influx of traffic due to a bombing at the nearby Gran Canaria Airport. As the only viable option for some of the heavier traffic, planes were diverted to Tenerife. However, the weather did not play its part, and fog rolled in as planes started their departures to their destinations. The fog on that fateful day severely restricted visibility, reducing the pilot's ability to navigate safely. Air traffic controllers struggled to manage the increased traffic volume amidst these adverse weather conditions, leading to delays and confusion on the ground. Included in these delays and confusion were two Boeing 747 jumbo jets. The aircraft type was just 7 years old at the time, and Pan American World Airways were the opening customer for the biggest passenger aircraft ever built. Pan Am Flight 1736, a Boeing 747-100, was stationed looking at the side of KLM Flight 4805, a newer and bigger Boeing 747-200B. The Pan Am flight originated from Los Angeles, with a stopover in New York. This was the original first 747 to be delivered to Pan Am, and the first 747 to fly commercially worldwide. Pan Am 1736 hosted 380 passengers and 16 crew, all bound for Gran Canaria. KLM 4805 was a charter flight being flown for Holland International Travel Group and initiated from Amsterdam. Because Flight 4805 was blocking Pan Am 1736's path to get out onto the runway, Flight 1736 was forced to wait an hour and a half longer than they needed to until the KLM flight was ready to leave. This led to KLM Flight 4805 having takeoff preference, and Captain Jacob Van Zanten was told to taxi all the way down the runway, then complete a 180-degree turn ready for takeoff. Captain Robert Bragg in the Pan Am 747 was told to follow the KLM down the runway and exit at point Charlie 3. Fog was becoming a serious problem at the airport at this time, with the Pan Am crew struggling to find their exit point. They got past Charlie 1 and Charlie 2, but missed the supposed exit point of Charlie 3 in the fog, which regardless would have required an impossible turn from the crew to navigate onto the empty taxiway. This led to the crew ending up at Charlie 4 and making their turn there. Meanwhile, the KLM crew had lined up and were waiting on the runway for clearance to take off. Captain Van Zanten starts to push the throttles forward for takeoff, but is stopped by his first officer, suggesting he gets takeoff clearance first. Van Zanten snaps back and tells the first officer to ask for clearance. The air traffic controller then gives KLM Flight 4805 their departure clearance, but not takeoff clearance, as the Pan Am flight is still on the runway. On the readback by the first officer, it is audible that Captain Van Zanten initiates the takeoff roll after the departure clearance was given, leading to the first officer's exclamation of, quote, "We are now at takeoff," end quote. Air traffic controllers picked up on this and told the KLM crew to stand by for takeoff, and that they will call them when they are clear. However, only the "stand by for takeoff" was heard and ignored by the KLM crew, due to the Pan Am flight also radioing through reminding the KLM crew they were still on the runway. This too was also not heard due to radio interference, and Van Zanten continued his takeoff roll down the runway. During this takeoff roll, the KLM flight engineer asked Van Zanten if Flight 1736 is clear of the runway, in which Van Zanten replies clearly with, quote, "Oh yes," end quote. At this time, through the fog, neither aircraft can see each other until about 700 meters before collision, where the Pan Am aircraft notices the landing lights of the fast approaching KLM 747. The crew increases power and pulls the aircraft towards the exit to avoid a head-on collision, while the KLM crew spot the Pan Am 747 on the runway, and Captain Van Zanten attempts to make evasive action by rotating earlier than expected, pulling the nose all the way up and scraping the tail on the ground. Just before collision, KLM 4805 lifts off the ground, but fails to gain enough altitude to avoid colliding with the 2-story tall Pan Am 747. The two 747s collide in a huge fireball, one which leads the KLM 747 back down onto the runway and exploding, killing all 248 passengers and crew on board. Pan Am 1736 gets a direct hit by the KLM aircraft, and there are significant chunks of the aircraft taken out, and fires burning across the wings and aircraft floor. 335 people on board the Pan Am aircraft were killed, with 61 survivors. This accident was, and still is, the deadliest aviation accident in history, with 583 people losing their lives in a chain of critical events. During the investigation, the investigators considered many theories to this, but in the end, one major factor was pointed out. Captain Van Zanten's eagerness to take off and get back was the major contributing factor to the accident, as had he not taken off and instead waited for takeoff clearance, the Pan Am aircraft would have gotten off at its exit point without any collisions. The investigation also considered other major factors, such as the fog, radio miscommunications, and the Pan Am crew missing their exit point. However, none of those came close to the main cause of the accident, being the takeoff roll conducted by Captain Van Zanten in KLM 4805.